Hello and welcome to the TASA 2020 webinar series. I'm Roger Wilkinson and I'm the TASA Digital Publications Editor. I'd like to introduce Dr. Michael Flood from QUT. His topic for today is Unpacking and Reconstructing Masculine Norms in Australia. Before we go on, TASA would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. Michael Flood has been studying masculinity for decades now, and he has a long-standing website now called XY, and the details are there.
So in today's webinar, I'm going to talk about two major pieces of research. One is a survey among young men and one is a survey among people in general, but both tell us something about attitudes towards masculinity, norms of masculinity in Australia. And I'm also going to talk about what we can do about it, how we might shape or reshape attitudes to or norms of masculinity in Australia. Now I'm going to share my screen so that you can see the slides I'll be drawing on. And those slides, I believe, will be made available to you. And I wanted to point out that the last couple of slides include links to the full reports that I'm summarising. So links to the full reports, links to pieces in the conversation, summarising those reports and so on. So there's certainly no shortage of information on the things I will be talking about. I'll just get rid of that. So let's have a look. Share screen, sorry. And I want to do that. There we go. So that should work. Do let me know straight away if my slides are not visible to you. There's growing attention in Australia and around the world to the gendered attitudes, practices and relations associated with men and boys and their implications. There are implications for health, for violence, for gender inequality. And there's a number of signs of this in Australia. There's intensified public debate over codes of masculinity. There's increasing scholarship on the links between masculinity and various social issues. There's activism and advocacy, and I've certainly been involved in that as well as other things. And there's a growing stream of work, of health promotion work and violence prevention work, self-consciously aimed at men and boys. In short, men and masculinities are on the public agenda. And there's certainly a wealth of evidence now, that masculinities, the social organisation of men's lives and relations, the meanings we give to being male, that masculinities are influential determinants of men's health and well-being. Masculinities are influential determinants of men's likelihoods of perpetrating violence, domestic or sexual violence, their involvements in fathering, the risks of suicide and so on. So there's growing interest in Australia in knowing about, addressing, changing notions and norms of masculinity. Now, one dimension of this is attitudinal. It's to do with men's and women's attitudes, what's in men's and women's heads, if you like, and particularly men's personal beliefs about manhood and gender. Another dimension overlapping with that is normative, norms of masculinity. That is, people's beliefs about what other men do, what men do or what other men do, and people's beliefs about what men should do. Now, there's various terms circulating in scholarship and in popular commentary for the things I've described. Early terms such as sex roles and gender roles, sex role stereotypes, the notion of traditional masculinity, the phrase pioneered by Raewyn Connell here in Australia, hegemonic masculinity, and of course the phrase toxic masculinity, which has been popularised through media commentary. But whatever term we use for these kind of sets of beliefs and attitudes about being a man, it's very clear that conformity to those has consequences. And I'll come back to that in a little while. The other thing I want to say before I look at these two bodies of data in particular is that there's more to masculinity than attitudes and norms. Other important dimensions of masculinity include behaviours and practices associated with being a man. The interpersonal relations among men and between men and women, men and children. And of course, the institutional and structural organisation of men's lives. So while there's growing attention to gender attitudes and gender norms, if we focus single-mindedly on those, we neglect the institutional and the structural determinants of gender relations. Nevertheless, addressing masculine attitudes is part of a project of change. So let's look at the first of these bodies of data. So this first body of data is about young men's attitudes to masculinity. And as I mentioned...
Oh, come here. What?
As I mentioned, the full reports on this data are available from slides in the last presentation. So I'm talking about the Man Box survey. And the Man Box survey is a national survey of 1,000 Australian men aged 18 to 30, so they're young adults. And it was completed as part of the Men's Project by Jesuit Social Services, which is a community organisation. So just to be clear, it wasn't me that designed or implemented this data, but I was commissioned by Jesuit Social Services to work with them and to write about and comment on this data. And this survey gathered data on young men's conformity to stereotypical or traditional ideas of manhood. That is, their own personal endorsement of a series of statements about masculinity and their perception that this is the message they get from society. So data about conformity to masculinity, but also data about their own behaviour, their own health. And the survey specifically asked these young men about their endorsement of 17 statements. 17 statements linked to 7 stereotypical masculine qualities. And I've listed those on the slide. They may not be visible to you, but those 7 stereotypical qualities were self-sufficiency, toughness, physical attractiveness, rigid gender roles, heterosexuality and homophobia, hypersexuality, and aggression and control. So what do we find? Let's have a look. So in terms of what young men agree with, which of those 17 statements, which of those qualities men endorse? Sorry, I've got some ambient noise here. If the ambient noise is too great, let me know. I can possibly close the window, but I hope it's manageable. So one of the things we noticed was that young men's endorsement of those qualities was higher for qualities like strength, physical attractiveness, control over women, and breadwinning than for other qualities. However, only about 1/3 to 1/2 of young men personally endorsed those qualities, personally agreed with statements suggesting that to be a man is to be strong, to be the breadwinner, to have control over women, and so on. Certainly substantial minorities of young men agree that men should always act strong, 47%. Men should be the breadwinners in households, 35%. Men should fight back when pushed, 34%. Lower proportions of young men agreed that to be a man is to avoid housework, to use violence to get respect, or to be hypersexual, that is, to always be ready for sex. So what does this tell us? Well, it tells us, one thing it tells us is that the man box, that kind of characterization of what it means to be a man, may not actually be the dominant set of cultural ideals among men. Large numbers of men, in this case 18 to 30-year-olds, may report attitudes and behaviours that depart from ostensibly dominant or stereotypical notions of masculinity. So this means what young men actually do, what young men actually think, may be different to some extent from the qualities identified in the man box measure and other typical measures of masculinity. Men's attitudes and practices in some ways may be more egalitarian, healthier, or more diverse than those represented by the man box. At the same time, significant minorities of young men did agree with some really patriarchal, some male-dominated ideas about being a man. For example, 27%, just over a quarter, agreed that men should have the final say in relationships. 37%, more than a third, agreed that men should know the movements of their wife and girlfriend at all times. And so, you know, this is a kind of mixed report on young men's attitudes to masculinity. Now, the Man Box survey data has been written up in 2 consecutive reports, and the first of these was in 2018. And in this 2018 report, we looked at the overall impact of conformity to masculinity, that is, agreement with those statements, on men's health and well-being. And we found, for example, that young men who conformed to dominant definitions of masculinity were more likely to suffer harm to themselves, more likely to have considered suicide, more likely to have taken risks driving, more likely to have drunk at risky levels, and so on. Young men who conform to traditional definitions of masculinity also were more likely to harm others, to have perpetrated sexual harassment, to have engaged in violence against women, violence against other men, and so on. So I won't talk in detail about that because in the more recent report, the 2020 report called Unpacking the Man Box, we dug down into those findings in greater detail. And what we looked at in particular was two things. First, we looked at the degree to which conformity to masculinity had an impact. We used regression analysis. Well, I didn't do the regression analysis, but I know what it means. We used regression analysis to determine the unique contribution of man box attitudes and those man box ideals to the behaviour and well-being of young men. And we did so controlling for other demographic factors, for socioeconomic status, for ethnicity, for class, for region, for sexuality, and so on. And so one of the key findings of this second report, Unpacking the Man Box, is that men's endorsement of masculine norms has a unique and powerful influence on a large number of harmful attitudes and behaviours, over and above other possible influences. So to pull out some of that, for example, belief in rigid masculine norms was 20 times more important, in fact 25 times more important than demographic variables in predicting the use of physical violence, sexual harassment and bullying. It was 11 times more important than demographic variables in predicting binge drinking, and 10 times more important in predicting negative mood, patterns of depression, suicidal thoughts, and so on. And so really, this, in a sense, this is a wake-up call. This should be a wake-up call to policymakers and advocates addressing problems of suicide, of violence, of binge drinking, and so on, that they need to pay attention to masculinity, that masculinity is one important influence on those forms of harmful behaviour. But that finding is in fact not at all surprising. There are over 500 studies over the last few decades that show consistently that men's belief in, men's conformity to masculine norms is linked to poor health outcomes. So that was one part of this Unpacking the Man Box report. The second part of this was looking at questions of which norm and which outcome. And in fact, we found that some elements of traditional masculinity, some of those 7 pillars of the man box, have far stronger relationships than others with negative outcomes. And in fact, some of those elements had associations with positive outcomes. They were protective of men's health in some ways. So in other words, while some masculine norms contribute to men's poor health, others are protective. And some masculine norms are more harmful than others. They have stronger associations with poor health among young men, or stronger associations with young men's harmful behaviour towards others. So for example, 2 of those 7 pillars, rigid gender roles and aggression and control, were the strongest predictors for most of the outcome variables. And what that suggests is that those 2 elements of stereotypical masculinity, rigid gender roles, and aggression and control are particularly dangerous, particularly harmful for men themselves and for those around them. So we looked at the question of which norm. We also looked at the question of which outcome. And the influence of men's endorsement of traditional masculine norms depends on the outcome in question. We found that specific unhealthy outcomes, specific unhealthy behaviours, are shaped more by some masculine norms than others. So for example, the perpetration of violence. The perpetration of violence, and this is violence against other men, but also against women, that was associated most strongly with men's conformity to rigid gender roles and their conformity to aggression and control. So that is men who agreed more with statements like, if a guy has a girlfriend or wife, he deserves to know where she is all the time. Or men should use violence to get respect if necessary. So they were values to do with aggression and control, but also rigid gender roles. So for example, we got higher rates of perpetration of violence among young men who agreed, for example, it is not good for a boy to be taught how to cook, sew, clean the house, or take care of younger children. So focusing on the perpetration of violence as one outcome, that had associations with some norms and not others. Same for suicidal thoughts. Suicidal thoughts were associated most strongly with men's conformity to hypersexuality and men's conformity to self-sufficiency. So for example, men were more likely to have had suicidal thoughts in the last fortnight if they agreed Men should figure out their personal problems on their own without asking others for help. So far I've talked about the specific norms, and that's a kind of variable or predictor-centered perspective. I've talked about need to address the specific outcomes, which is an outcome-centered perspective. But there's a third factor, a third way of asking about this data that we didn't do, that I'm interested in doing in further work. And that's an outcome, that's a person-centered perspective looking at the men and their contexts. And this perspective emphasizes that the consequences of conformity to traditional masculinity differ for different groups of individuals. And there's certainly some evidence suggesting that from other research. So one way to extend the work I've already described is to examine groups or profiles or clusters of men themselves, to look at how men themselves cluster in terms of their endorsement of masculine norms and their participation in particular behaviours. So some kind of cluster analysis or latent class analysis to identify the groups or clusters of men who engage in high-risk behaviours and the men who don't. Now, I want to add here that there's a risk. There's a risk in focusing attention on groups or categories or types of men. One of those is that in Australia, as in many countries, there are common kind of stereotypes of the bad men, the men who assault women, the men who behave badly. And they're often racist and classist accounts of other men. So we need to work to avoid those. We also need to work to avoid static or fixed notions or categories or types of masculinity. We need more sociological and sophisticated accounts of men's practices and men's relations. Okay, that's the first survey. So the Man Box survey among young men, 18 to 30. Let's look at the second survey. So the second survey also tells us about norms of masculinity in Australia. And this was a survey commissioned by Vic Health, the Victorian Health Promotion Foundation, a nationally representative survey of 1,619 respondents, 16 and older. So it has some obvious differences from the first survey. It's among men and women rather than just men. It's all ages, well, 16 and older rather than 18 to 30. It looks only at agreement with certain sets of statements rather than also looking at behaviour or well-being. They're the main differences. But it does give us a stock take of Australians' attitudes towards men, masculinities and gender. And the detail of the study, I think, is really fascinating in terms of what people agree with or don't agree with, and you'll find that in the full report, which I've listed on the last slides. So to run through some of this, as you'd expect, there's a continuum. There's a continuum of gendered attitudes from progressive to conservative, from those highly supportive of feminist understandings, or feminist or progressive understandings, to those highly opposed to them. Now, the Vic Health survey involved a kind of pre-existing categorisation. It didn't look for how people clustered. It assumed that we could talk about three groups: supporters, persuadables, and opponents. And it classified people into those three groups, depending on their overall scores on its measures of attitudes towards gender. And doing that, Vic Health found that that supporters with the highest levels of support for gender equality are about 1/4 of the Australian population. About half the Australian population are persuadables. They show lower levels of support, mixed support or opposition, and then opponents, again about 1/4 of the overall population, who are opposed to typical feminist positions on men and gender. So, three broad groups. Of course, on the ground, we will see more mixed and blurry patterns. But looking at the data itself, one of the striking patterns is a gender gap. And this is not surprising based on other research. There's a consistent gender gap in attitudes, where men's attitudes towards gender are consistently less progressive, more conservative than women's. Men in general are less supportive of principles of gender equality, less likely to see sexism as extensive, as systematic, and more likely to endorse men's dominance in public and in private. And one of the interesting things is that men are even less aware than women of the constraints of masculinity themselves. Men are less likely than women to agree that stereotypes of norms of masculinity limit men or constrain men, or have an impact, that conformity has an impact on men. Looking at that attitudinal breakdown, those segments I mentioned before, supporters, persuadables, opponents, twice as many women as men are supporters, twice as many men as women are opponents. Looking at this the other way around, if we look just at the supporters, 2/3 of those are women. If we look just at the opponents, 2/3 of those are men, whereas persuadables are sort of roughly half-half, men and women. So let's look at more of the detail. And I've got, let's have a look. How many slides do I have? 4 slides about some of those patterns. So one of the things which is interesting is there's widespread agreement among people in Australia that traditional gender stereotypes are limiting, that they're limiting and harmful for boys and men. Most people agree that there's pressure on men to live up to traditional masculine stereotypes, that masculine expectations or outdated ideas of masculinity constrain men, prevent them from living full lives, and that traditional ideas about masculinity contribute to social problems, particularly things like suicide. There's higher recognition of that than, say, domestic violence, masculinity contributing to that, but nevertheless, there's still some recognition. What about specific masculine norms? And I mentioned 2 on this slide. Support for traditional definitions of masculinity in terms of compulsory heterosexuality, homophobia, is relatively weak in Australia. Few people agree that a real man has to be heterosexual. There's also only weak support for the patriarchal idea that men should dominate and control women in relationships. Although, as we saw from that previous survey and in this survey, large minorities of men, and particularly young men, which is particularly troubling, I think, do support those ideas. What about the notion of gender as biologically determined on the one hand, or socially constructed? There's broad support for an understanding of gender as socially constructed, that boys' and men's lives and relations are shaped by social forces as much as they are by biology. At the same time, there is also support for the notion of natural differences between men and women. And there's greater endorsement of biological essentialist ideas, of notions of genetics or hormones determining men's behaviour when presented in those terms. So present people with biologically essentialist ideas and they're more likely to agree to them than when you reverse them and present them in social constructionist terms. There's widespread recognition of the need to open up gender roles for men, particularly in terms of them constraining men's own health and men's own well-being. So it's kind of a men's health, men's well-being understanding rather than a more explicitly feminist understanding of the problems of masculinity. Most people agree that progress towards gender equality, breaking free of gender stereotypes, will be good for men. And there's very high agreement, almost universal agreement, that men can play a role in preventing violence against women. Respondents in this second survey were presented with some anti-feminist messages, and they do attract substantial support. So, for example, ask people if they agree criticising masculinity is unfair because most men are good and decent, and substantial proportions agree. Likewise, there's support for the notion that men are being lectured too much about toxic masculinity. And this survey, other earlier surveys, do find that anti-feminist views have a general currency among people in Australia. And overall levels of sympathy with those views are troublingly high, particularly among opponents, but also more generally. Particularly with notions that men in general or masculinity is being unfairly criticised and tarnished and so on. One really interesting finding from this research is that framing matters. How we frame messages about gender has a significant impact on whether people agree with them. When people are offered anti-feminist messages, regressive messages, substantial proportions of the population will endorse them. And people who are opponents, people with pre-existing conservative views, will endorse them much more than persuadables or supporters. But when we frame statements in progressive views, on the other hand, the opposition in this survey doesn't look very different at all from persuadables. The levels of agreement with progressive or feminist messages is almost as high as that among persuadables, lower than among supporters, but almost as high as among persuadables. And in fact, persuadables often are unsure. They don't know what they think. They often respond, don't know, unsure. 20 to 30% say that. And that tells us that a significant proportion of the population haven't thought much about these issues and may be quite malleable. Okay. One of the other bits of this survey, this Vic Health survey, was something called dial testing. And dial testing involved presenting survey respondents with 30-second audio messages, and they listened to those audio messages, and as they listened, they could turn a dial to signal their agreement or disagreement with that message as it played aloud. And the respondents in that survey, the 1,600 people, were presented with 5 spoken messages, testing different ways of framing men and masculinity. The first 4 of those messages were positive, if you like, whereas the 5th was oppositional. So to look at a couple of them, the first one, free men. Men and boys are restricted by masculine stereotypes and should be free from them. These, what you can see in front of you is my summary of these 5 messages, but in a moment I'll show you what the messages actually look like. In fact, I'll skip ahead a slide. I'm going to show you, this is an example of the data from the dial testing. This was testing the message free men. And the text you can see there was the 30-second audio message. And so, you know, there's a voice that they listen to. We should all be free to live open, honest, and meaningful lives. But too many men and boys are still trapped by outdated ideas about being a real man. And the message goes on, that 30-second message. And the data below shows you how people responded to that message. They start at 50% and they can disagree or agree. Agree is up, disagree is down. And the 3 lines there, the top line are the supporters. They were most supportive of the free men message. Their levels of agreement were higher over the course of the message. The middle line are persuadables, less supportive but still largely supportive. And below them, the opposition. And you can see the opposition didn't overall disagree with this message. They actually overall agreed with this message. And their levels of agreement were relatively close to those of supporters, sorry, those of persuadables, and so on. You can't see the tiny figures on the left, but agreement starts at 50 and it's in 10% increments. So 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100. That was the free men message. Let's look at a very different message, the opposition message. This is a very different message. Feminists and other gender-bending experts are waging a war on men, treating masculinity as if it were a disease. Attacking men for the crime of being masculine benefits no one, and so on. And you can see that the supporters, the green line, they didn't like this message at all. They agreed a bit, but then they dipped below 50%, about a third of the way in. They start dipping as soon as they hear the ideas behind gender equality have now gone too far. They come up again when the message says we should celebrate the vast majority of good and decent men, but they dive again when the message says let our boys be boys. And you can see how that contrasts with, say, the opposition. That's the red line. They were most supportive, and so on. So testing these 5 messages, opponents showed the highest levels of support for the opposition message, as you might expect. But the levels of support for the other 4 messages were also reasonably high. So in other words, when we present opponents, people who have more conservative attitudes towards gender, when we present opponents with a desirable message, they're relatively supportive of it and only slightly less supportive than persuadables. So in other words, opponents act like a persuadable audience when we put forward our case. However, when we offer a conservative message, an anti-feminist message, when persuadables are presented with it, you know, that feminists are waging a war on men, that kind of thing, they're reasonably supportive of it. So let's go have a look, in fact. We can look at this data. So the persuadables were reasonably supportive. Their levels of agreement hover between 60 and 70%, 60 and 70%, whereas the opposition is slightly higher, between kind of 60 and 80%. But so persuadables are sympathetic to this opposition message when they're presented with it. Let's go back. But supporters, on the other hand, very much reject it. So the point I'm trying to make here is that framing matters. The way we frame messages matters. And Vic Health has taken this research then to inform a healthy messaging guide, literally a guide to how to do communications and social marketing work aimed at men and promoting healthy masculinities. And one of its take-home lessons from this research is that we shouldn't explicitly refer to opposition messages to a feminist war on men. Even if we say, for example, some people say there's a feminist war on men, but that's not true. Feminists are supportive of healthy masculinity. Referring to that message can entrench opposition perspectives. And so there are other strategies that are more effective. But I want to move on and offer some wider reflections on masculinity. This data, the 2 surveys I've referred to, they're snapshot data. They can't tell us about change over time. But other data does tell us that gender norms in Australia are changing. Gender norms or gender attitudes are improving in Australia. There's been an increase in support for basic norms of gender equality, especially when it comes to support for women's participation in paid work and political decision-making. There is more support for men's domination in private life, in families and relationships, than for men's domination of public life, paid work and political decision making. And what's troubling is there's been no shift in that support for men's domination of family and relationships in a decade. There's been a stagnating of progress towards progress in attitudes towards gender equality. Nevertheless, there is overall progress, overall improvements in gender attitudes over 2009 to 2017. There have also been increases, though, in some regressive attitudes. What about young men? What about our sons? I've got a 15-year-old, for example. Some of you have sons or know young men. Where do our sons, the future men of our country, stand on these issues? Young men, aged 16 to 17, do show better attitudes than adult men on many issues. But young men's attitudes typically are far poorer, more conservative than those of young women. There's an enormous kind of gender gap there. And young men have some of the highest levels of endorsement of men's use of violence, of homophobia, breadwinner roles, and men's power in relationships. Now, the data I've described so far is quantitative, and I'm conscious, my training is qualitative, and there is rich sociological insight to be gained from qualitative research. And there's some very good qualitative research in Australia about men's performances of masculinity, their negotiations of masculinity, and that does give a richer and more complex idea than the data I presented to you today. Now, I focused on attitudes and norms, but as I've said, they're only part of gender. Gender also involves behaviours and practices, people's interpersonal relations, social institutions, social structures. So in paying attention to gender, we have to pay attention also to practices, relations, and structures. I want to end with just a couple of minutes commentary on reconstructing masculine norms. So, we have to step up the work of changing norms of masculinity in Australia. There are promising initiatives in Australia and elsewhere, and we have to step up the scale and intensity of this work. Our job, our task above all, is to transform gender, to work for the transformation of gender roles and relations towards gender justice. In the 2018 Man Box report, I argued for three tasks. I argued that we need to highlight the harms of the man box, highlight the harms of conformity to stereotypical masculinity. We have to weaken the cultural grip of those norms, and we have to promote ethical and healthy alternatives. So extending those, we have to disseminate and scale up effective initiatives to engage men and boys. And for existing efforts to address suicide, mental health, antisocial public behaviour, violence, and so on, we have to do more to build attention to masculinity into those existing efforts. We also have to get specific. We have to do more to address particular norms and particular men. We have to, given the research I've described, we have to address the specific norms associated with negative outcomes among boys and men and those around them. And we have to target our interventions to the groups and contexts at highest risk of harm. We also have to get specific about the forms of manhood or personhood we do want. We have to develop and popularise detailed and diverse accounts of progressive, healthy, egalitarian forms of manhood or personhood. We have to turn up the volume on the fact of diversity and change among men. We have to pay more attention to men's and boys' active resistance, their non-conformity, their resistance to masculine norms and relations, and explore the protective value of non-conformity. We have to criticise and push back against the pervasive policing of masculinity. And finally, changing masculine norms is only one part of a wider project. Men's and boys' attitudes and behaviours are bound up with structures and patterns of power and inequality. So we have to tackle not only the norms that express unhealthy and oppressive forms of manhood, but the institutional and structural forces that sustain these. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks so much. And I'd like to invite people to ask questions. And if that's the case, you'll need to unmute your microphone. And just to reinforce once again that Michael needs to leave at 5 to 1. So anyone like to make comments or questions?
I tell my students they can write in chat too if they'd rather not be out loud. So you can just,
yes,
comment or question in chat as well, I think.
Yes, Josephine Brown has a question. Yes, Josephine, would you like to unmute?
Hi.
Thanks,
Michael. Thanks very much for that. I'm just wondering about your comments about the discrepancy between men believing that it's like more equitable arrangements are okay in public spaces but not within the private realm. Can you comment more about how we might address that or the causes of that, like that public-private divide there?
Look, I think that's a great question, Josephine. I think there's a couple of things going on, and this is off the top of my head, but I think one thing that's going on is that the impacts that feminism, and probably liberal feminism in particular, have been precisely in relation to women's access to public institutions, paid work and political decision-making. And other feminist critiques of questions of power and sexism in intimate and personal life, which I think are associated more with, say, radical feminism, have had less currency and less traction in Australian society. So I think it's partly about what forms of feminism and feminist critique have been influential. I think it's also about the intractability of particular sets of gender norms around sexuality and gender to do with intimacy, to do with sexuality, ones for which there's been less attention and less critique. Other questions or comments?
Yes.
Denunciations.
Clarifications.
Pontifications, that's right. I can see a question from Anna Hallahoff here.
Anna. Go ahead, Anna.
Yeah, so this is a question about culture and religion and how they affected response. From memory, demographic factors did not have strong associations in general with, actually no, that's not true. I'm trying to think what the demographic factors were. There were both unsurprising and surprising findings in terms of young men's conformity to masculinity. So there were higher levels of conformity with the man box among young men with religious affiliations, you'd expect that, and among heterosexual young men, again, you'd expect that. There were two surprising findings though. One was higher levels of conformity among young men in urban locations rather than regional and remote locations, and education. And we struggle to make sense of that because that's contrary to other data, finding that gender attitudes are more conservative in rural areas and gender attitudes are more conservative among those with lower levels of education. But certainly in relation to the latter, and that it was asking about current study rather than whether you had ever done tertiary education. And it may have been picking up on, for example, cohorts of young men in relatively conservative gender cultures he had relatively little relationship with gender norms, but I think larger data sets like the National Community Attitude Survey do show some associations between ethnicity and gender attitudes.
Michael, maybe while we're waiting, I notice on your website that you have your one of the 2018 book called, I'm not sure. Well,
it's in the middle there, Engaging Men and Boys in Violence Prevention.
Yes, it's available free as a free download.
I won't tell my publisher, but yes, it is.
So if anyone would like a copy of Michael's latest book, perhaps just email me and I'll send you the link.
You can see I have a kind of activist and educator bent as well as being an academic, and I'm interested in the kind of practical or social change implications of this work, as I'm sure some of the people on this webinar are. So, do people have thoughts on that, whether that's about parents raising sons or promoting healthy masculinities or shifting gender norms or tackling, smashing the patriarchy? What are people's thoughts about some of the practical implications of this work?
And popular culture. It's not a case, I don't think, where we're providing different role models for men. We're bringing what is acceptable behaviour women to movies now where the woman is actually the aggressor and quite physical and has a physicality there that is not part of what was normal culture. So portrayed as, rather than how men are portrayed. This is probably a completely ignorant question. This is not my field, but it's an observation.
No, look, it's a great observation, Vanessa, and called the stalled gender revolution. And she comments on how there's been much more of a move of women into, in some sense, into feminized spaces. And to give the example, I mean, the kind of popular example I use when I'm doing a media interview is that parents over the last 2 decades have thought much more about how they raise their daughters and encouraging their daughters to kick a footy around or aspire to be an astronaut or a prime minister, and far less in terms of giving compassionate and so on. I mean, there's versions of that story that I think are regressive, but, you know, there's some insight there. And likewise, so on the question of role models, there's a kind of simplistic story that's part of the men's movement and some, you know, sort of men's issues work about the need for male role models with boys, but it rarely asks which role models, and it rarely, I think, pays attention to the wider.
Now, I noticed Josephine Brown has made a comment. Would you like to speak to that, Josephine, or would you just like Michael to comment on that?
I don't want to dominate the time. I was just saying that when we discuss that a lot in sociology and sociology of families, the relative freedom of girls to inhabit all sorts of former masculine spaces, but the discrepancy, exactly. And we link that to, you know, wider relations of structural power and things that you also mentioned in the talk. So, yeah, it's always a fascinating conversation.
But one of the interesting bits of the second survey, the Big Health survey, was these kind of forced choice questions, for example, about role models. And people had to choose between statements like, you know, boys need good role models of any gender, or boys need good role models whether they're men or women. And people were much more comfortable with the second one that referred explicitly to men or women than they were to something that used a kind of de-gendered language. So in a sense, you know, people were prepared to cope with the idea that boys could have desirable role models who were women, but they were more uncomfortable with the idea that of a kind of de-gendered account of that. And it sort of gives us clues as to how we might frame, I think, progressive and feminist messages. Some things are going to push people's buttons. Likewise, the term masculinity. You know, I take for granted that the term masculinity embodies a social constructionist and so on. But lots of people hear masculinity and think you just mean men. So when you criticize masculinity, they don't think you're criticizing dominant norms, they think you're attacking men. So again, being strategic, language matters in terms of building support for progressive feminist challenges to gender inequalities.
Can I just speak to that? And thanks for your presentation. There's a bunch of us here who are from JCU who are working in the JCU Respect area, which is sort of our violence prevention, sexual assault, sexual harassment, that kind of thing, and work face-to-face with students and do online modules and all of those things. And I guess it's just always trying everyone immediately go, oh no, not this, and you know, and so I guess it's been really helpful to think more about that framing and what we just might not say at all, rather than naming some. It's not always helpful to name some things when you're just trying to get through the issues. But one of the things that we found is we had to start dealing with you know, the question about what about the men right at the beginning of anything that we do, because if we started talking about women's experiences, everybody got stuck. And so that was something we addressed right at the front of face-to-face sessions. Yeah, but I just wondered if you had any ideas about, you know, those college-age student male groups, and we sort of do mixed groups, and we tried some sex segregate segregated groups, but yeah.
Yeah, I've certainly written at length about precisely that, about how you engage men, groups of young men, for example, or other groups in addressing domestic and sexual violence, things that really will shut men down very quickly, and many men feel defensive and blamed about anyway. And so, to give a plug for my book, it is free, so I'm not making any money out of this plug, but my book does have a lengthy chapter on ways to engage and appeal to men and boys. And it talks about the need, for example, to personalise the issues and to draw in the first instance on boys and men's own care and commitment to the girls and women in their lives, their own values, no matter how kind of underdeveloped they may be, but also to go beyond that. You don't want the way you try to, say, talk to the young men in the groups you describe, you don't want it to shut them down. You don't want them to just sort of shut down and feel defensive on the one hand. On the other hand, you don't want them to feel so comfortable work whatsoever that you've not challenged their sexist or violence supportive attitudes and behaviours. And it's very practice focused. It's very focused on how to do this work well. Likewise, the Vic Health guide, which is on the Vic Health page, the second link there, that's a kind of framing healthy masculinities guide. That would be handy as well. But some level of discomfort is, in a sense, desirable or inevitable. But there are ways to make it less likely that people will shut down instantly.
There's a message there privately. I'll email. Or if,
well, I would hope you could distribute the slides actually with these.
Yeah, well, that'll be great. And so, given the time, firstly by thanking Michael and thanking all the participants and the questions. And this is being recorded, and within 24 hours, this should be available on Facebook and perhaps some